In her descent into the underworld of Irkalla, the Sumerian goddess Inanna encountered a series of 7 gates, upon which she was required to strip away ever more of her jewels and ornaments until she was left bare and powerless within the enveloping darkness beneath the surface of the world. Only after shedding the powers of the diurnal world of light, rationality, and egoity can we descend deeper into the foundations of being. Beneath the incessant monologues of the dialogical mind, we find only breath. Then beneath breath, we find only darkness, and beneath darkness, only warmth. We must become darkness, and then become darkness, transforming into breath. And then allow ourselves to become the emptiness which is filled by darkness, and the stillness which is filled by warmth, the singularity which is divided by breathing. Within that emptiness, we find the archaic clay from which our consciousness is molded, the awareness which is truly fundamental, truly originary. Within this ever-present origin, there is stillness, an emptiness within which there is nothing and yet also everything. All possibilities of a blank canvas, an empty sky, an infinity of luminous forms contained within an endless, nameless, formless darkness. Being and nothingness intertwined in an eternal, ever-present, and intimate conjugation of pure, boundless experience. Within this oceanic expanse of potentiality, one possibility is experienced with an intensity and urgency which distinguishes it from all others, one form above all which resonates throughout the whole of the origin. The possibility that the emptiness of primordial feeling might come to be shaped and molded, such that stillness might be ruptured by motion, that undifferentiated oneness might come to be unfolded and intensified. The form of numinosity, the possibility of the ultimate unification of selfhood with radical otherness, is thus felt within every droplet of being and nothingness, and from this originary feeling is then born a compulsion, a will to becoming, through which the possible comes to necessitate the actual, a will to life which ceaselessly moves upon the face of the deep. Stillness becomes vibration, and within these vibrations we find the polar syzygy of form and formlessness, elaborated in a new way. Oscillations of intensity and void, expansion and contraction, density and vacuity. The one becomes many, and through multiplicity, the cosmic syzygy finds novel expression once more in dynamic interplay. Constructive and destructive interference give rise to patterns of tension and releasement, as the primordial masculine and feminine principles begin to sing the world into being. Radiance and vacuity are thus intersected by the polarity of synthesis and annihilation, and the oneness of the ever-present origin is crucified by its own creation, thus unfolding the basic modalities of experience and aliveness. The tetrahedral crucifix becomes the octahedron, thereby revealing the elemental modalities of the mental, astral, etheric, and corporeal, archetypal pyra, anima, vita, and soma, which we find given expression within the material realm as fire, wind, water, and stone. Here, the fractal nature of animacy first begins to disclose itself. As we recreate the cosmogonic unfolding within our own consciousness, we begin to see that the transition from the tetrahedron to the octahedron is itself the first motion of a process which is itself organized in accordance with the elemental modes. The metamorphosis of the tetrahedron into the octahedron is the emergence of the empyrean, the pyrrhic plane of the pleroma from ousia, the fifth element, which here represents the archaic awareness of consciousness as such. As the scission of the luminous abyss gives birth to separation and distinction, plurality is then able to facilitate the prismatic interplay of light and darkness. Vibrational interference unfolds itself into chromatic tonality. The conjugation of light and darkness becomes a spectrum of color, and the sidereal octahedron thus becomes the prismatic dodecahedron. The empyrean gives birth to the astral realm of prana and anima, and thus gives birth to the basic elements of animate agency. Expansion and contraction become recursion, rotation, and spirality, as the sonorous vibrations of the empyrean come to be woven together by prismatic and sidereal forces. A cosmic vortex thus comes to form, which will serve as the astral womb, within which the vital processes of the etheric realm will come to be gestated. The prismatic and elemental beings are thus brought into dynamic interplay with one another through the cyclical interplay of radiance and vacuity. Oscillations of light and darkness come to manifest as wakefulness and sleep, the diurnal and the nocturnal, waxing and waning, summer and winter, spring and autumn. The prismatic dodecahedron and sidereal octahedron are thereby merged so as to become the icosahedron, and the astral phase of cosmogenesis becomes the etheric realm of vital forces. Time comes to exhibit new forms of dimensionality as past and future begin to interpenetrate, thereby forming cycles within cycles, wheels within wheels. The zodiacal powers are thus unfolded, and begin to prepare the conditions for the emergence of the fifth plane of existence. The cosmic vortex of the astral phase begins to produce the etheric bodies of the first stellar, plasmatic organisms, and the elemental beings begin to express themselves as radiation, electricity, magnetism, and gravitation, as atomic organisms are molded by the zodiacal beings into stellar and galactic organisms. Fire is thus breathed into the engines, which will come to produce densified somatic materiality. Through this production of densified matter, planets will begin to take shape as embryonic titans of magma, the pyrrhic, fiery subphase of cosmogonic materialization. These spheres of burning stone then cool and stabilize, and thereby the differentiation which was achieved in previous phases comes to manifest as physical separation. The vital, etheric bodies of the stars and atoms are interwoven with one another within the pre-spatial, pre-geometric realms of the pleroma and akasha. But with the cooling of the planetary spheres, the etheric bodies of atomic organisms conjoin in accordance with geometric patterns so as to form crystalline structures, which are characterized by geometries of distance. Formative morphogenetic proximity thus becomes physical, spatial proximity for the first time. The dimension of distance can thus be elaborated into relations of height, width, and depth. Thereby, the zodiacal dodecahedron produces the 3 axes and 6 faces of cardinality which characterize the hexahedron, the Saturnian cube which represents the geometric organization of physical determinations. The creation of the somatic realm represents the ultimate axis of the cosmogonic journey. the point of greatest densification and separation, within which consciousness is most constricted and truncated by the limitations imposed by efficient and material causality. This constriction, however, also serves an immensely consequential purpose, as it is this very fallenness which allows the somatic realm to act as a stable foundation upon which greater complexification can come to be realized. The rigidity of the molecular, crystalline world is what allows it to provide the building blocks needed for the recreation of divinity within the lives of separate, individuated beings. The conditions are thereby created for the emergence of biological life. Through the etheric forces of radiation, electricity, magnetism, and gravity, the zodiacal beings are able to reach into the somatic realm and cultivate the organismic composition of the physical. Through the vital powers of the electromagnetic ether, somatic crystallinity becomes metallic. Through gravitational contraction and kinetic expansiveness, etheric prana comes to manifest as the circulatory breathing of planetary orbits. Etheric pyra comes to manifest as combustion, flame, and plasma. Dynamics of circulation, interference, and resonance come to be elaborated through their shaping of the life processes which constitute the terrestrial realm. Each phase of cosmogenesis comes to elaborate a distinct ontological layer of the world's composition, and we find these distinct layers within the organization of our own existence just as much as we find them within the natural world around us. Each layer represents a nuanced complex of organizational principles, as well as interrelated networks of agency, memory, and awareness. The forces at play in the shaping of our world are not simply inert, timeless forms or static archetypes. They are living beings, which are constantly at work in the shaping of cosmogonic narratives, whether those are narratives of astrophysical, biological, or historical evolution, or the more seemingly mundane narratives of individual human lives. By striving to see through that which is disclosed by our sensory organs, we can begin to see into the harmonic patterns which precondition the manifestation of physical reality. Just as we can discern the purposiveness which is expressed within a musical performance, we can likewise begin to perceive the purposiveness which is present within all aspects of our own existence and the world we find ourselves within. The world begins to be rendered transparent by the human psyche, and the diaphaneity of being is thereby revealed. Over the course of the modern age, the project of scientific naturalism has oriented itself towards the disclosure of matter, to discern the objective reality of physical objects and processes which are said to lie beyond the veil of human subjective awareness. Matter, however, has remained ever elusive. Science has never arrived at the concrete, solid physicality which was presumed to lie beneath the phenomenological world which is actually encountered by human experience. What has been revealed instead has been a world of fields, of diffuse distributions of potential events, nebulous clouds of possibility which lack any of the properties of densified somatic physicality. An electromagnetic field cannot be encountered directly by human sensory organs, as our sensory organs detect interaction events which have already taken place. While bodies are composed of self-perpetuating, cyclical systems of such interactions, fields are instead the structures of possibility which condition such interactions. The noetic or spiritual realm cannot be directly encountered by the senses, in other words, because the sensory, physical world is the activity of the noetic. The morphology of the noetic, therefore, is seen by the psyche, not by the eyes. We see the shape of an electromagnetic field, for example, by seeing the patterns which are disclosed through the activities of that field. Such activities can be directly encountered by the eyes, while the field itself is a pattern of possible activities which must be seen through pattern recognition rather than sensation. The word matter shares a close etymological connection with the word mother. As we have already seen, the most primordial principle of the feminine is that of formlessness, the pure potentiality of undifferentiated being, which is then given concrete definition through its conjugation with the masculine principle of form. In its quest for matter, science has engaged in the unconscious pursuit of the Great Mother, of the formless abyssal womb which conditions the possibility of the empirical. Within noetic fields, we find such formlessness expressed as the undecidedness and indeterminacy of the possibility distribution. Simultaneously, however, we also find the masculine principle of determination as well. Such fields are not merely amorphous clouds, but rather exhibit a morphology, which is characterized by gradients of intensity. Such fields collapse into concrete, determinate events, and these events are thus incorporated into the living body of the past. They come to inform the formless void which lies beneath the natural world. The matter which science has pursued is revealed to be both nothingness and everything. Alongside matter, the correlative goal of science has been the pursuit of physical laws, the principle of determination which matter is said to be coerced by. Yet in its quest for such rules, science has come instead to find only suggestions, the structures of possible determinations which are navigated by animate processes. Science has thus come to resign itself to the formulation of mathematical tools, through which probabilistic predictions might be made, while the quest for genuine explanations has come to be abandoned. In discovering that matter consists of formlessness rather than physicality, and discovering that the formative composition of nature consists in attractors rather than laws, we arrive upon the realization that the quest of natural philosophy must be completed through the exploration of the archetypal and the noetic, rather than the generalization of the physical through mathematical abstraction. Beneath the phenomenological, we come to find the or phenomena, the patterns of possible relationships which constitute the harmonic compositionality of nature. Words like harmonic or composition are not meant to be poetic gestures here. By considering the phenomenology of music, we can begin to see that the noetic awareness which I am describing is in fact an omnipresent feature of human consciousness in general, one which is continually operative at an unconscious level, still waiting to be illuminated and elaborated through its incorporation into our conscious awareness. Our ability to recognize musical form is in no way contingent upon the specific frequencies of sound. We might recognize the same song performed in two completely different contexts, as it is played at a different tempo and key signature, and with two completely different sets of instruments. None of the specific manifestations are identical, and yet we are nevertheless able to recognize it as the same song, because our perception of the musical piece is not the perception of frequencies or even of notes. What we actually experience phenomenologically is the musical form itself, independently of the particular frequencies or textures of sound which might be participating in the manifestation of that form. Even the specific relationships might be distinct. A drummer might improvise such that the overall rhythmic form remains the same on each playing of the piece, while nevertheless each performance is unique in terms of the specific details through which that form is articulated. Again, we find that what we actually encounter within our experience is the formative, noetic contents which are being realized, the shape of the cloud of possibility, which is the musical morphology. If we now return to the compositional elements presented within our cosmogonic narrative, we can find that the exact same principles are at work. The phenomena which we actually encounter within musical perceptions are in fact the experiences of or phenomena. Without such noetic insight, the phenomenon of sound would simply be the experience of noise. This diagram is an elaboration of the theory of colors developed during the early 19th century by the German philosopher, poet, and naturalist Johann von Goethe. Goethe was initially compelled to develop a novel, phenomenological theory of light and color due to inadequacies which he came to see within the Newtonian optical theory which had prevailed since the opening of the 18th century. Through examining the Goethean theory of colors and its contrast with Newtonian optical theory, we can begin to elucidate the epistemological demands which would be made of us by a truly noetic science, while also bringing to light the fundamentally harmonic, musical nature of the world's underlying composition. In 1704, Isaac Newton published his Optics, in which Newton articulated the theory of light and color which he had developed through his experimental investigations over the course of previous years. Newton experimented with glass prisms and showed that as a beam of white light passes through a prism, a spectrum of colors can be produced upon an opposing surface. Newton took this phenomenon to imply that all of the various colors of the visible spectrum were contained within the beam of white light, and that the prism served only to separate these colors such that they could be distinguishable from one another. Newton came to conjecture that this production of the color spectrum was due to the separation of the white beam into separate bands of light corpuscles. Different colors were presumed to represent different sizes of these corpuscles, and within white light it was presumed that all of the different types of corpuscles were amalgamated together homogeneously. The role of the prism, therefore, was thus to cause these different types of corpuscles to take different paths through the prism, thus producing the spectral rainbow. For well over 300 years now, this Newtonian understanding of color has been taken to exemplify scientific methodology in general, and although the corpuscular theory of light is now taken to be an oversimplification, the general form of Newton's theory remains intact within science textbooks even to this day. But in the early 19th century, Johann von Goethe came to realize that there were many aspects of the actual phenomenon of color which could not be accounted for within the Newtonian framework. Goethe came to see that color could not simply be a property of some microscopic particles which were presumed to comprise light. If a given color, such as blue, were simply identical to light corpuscles of a certain size, or light waves of a given wavelength for that matter, then we would expect the same light to produce the same color regardless of context. If the color were to change, then we would be forced to infer that the corpuscles of light were changing size, or that the waves of light were changing their wavelengths. Through his extensive experimental investigations detailed in The Theory of Colors, published in 1810, Goethe demonstrated, among other things, how the very same light could produce an array of different color phenomena depending upon context. This is a fact which we can see in various types of so-called optical illusions, and one which Isaac Newton himself came to be aware of in his own research. Newton saw that this relational variability of color was a serious problem for his color theory. A given color simply could not be identical with a specific physical property of light. Newton therefore concluded instead that color itself must be a kind of subjective quality rather than a truly objective quality. The Newtonian color theory was thus ultimately taken to imply that the actual phenomenon of blue, for example, was merely a subjective experience of certain physical properties of light, while the light itself, independently of subjective consciousness, was essentially colorless. The objective reality of light, therefore, is constituted only by such physical properties, while colors are in effect no more than the qualitative stamps which the human mind uses in order to organize our sensations of the underlying objective properties. In other words, Newton's optical theory, despite seemingly being a theory which might account for the empirical reality of color, does not in fact account for the reality of color phenomena at all. Color itself simply falls out of the theory, and its nature is relegated to the inner confines of human subjectivity, and thus drained away from the objective reality of the natural world. Newton's conclusions are in keeping with the more general epistemic presumptions of the British empiricist tradition, which has generally presumed that the truly objective properties of the natural world are fundamentally quantifiable, physical properties such as mass, volume, and length, which can seemingly be conjectured without implicating subjective awareness at all. Although we might assume that Newton's methodology is a more empirically rigorous approach to science than one which accounts for the role of consciousness, in reality the Newtonian approach inevitably comes to completely discard the reality of color as an empirical phenomenon. Our initial observations of color come to be obfuscated and replaced by unobservable light corpuscles in order to artificially enforce the division between mind and matter. Goethe, however, aspired to remain within the reality of color phenomena, which we actually observe empirically within nature. Through his extensive documentation of the vast range of different color phenomena, Goethe came to carefully document the ways in which color comes to actually manifest through the relationships between human consciousness and the dynamic interplay of light and darkness. Setting himself in stark contrast with the Newtonian methodology, Goethe tells us to, quote, "seek not beyond the phenomena of color for a theory. The phenomena themselves are the theory." We thus see Goethe's theory not within an abstract notion of unobservable particles, but rather within his color wheel, which expresses the manner by which manifestations of light, darkness, and color are actually related to one another within our observations. The Goethean color theory, therefore, consists in the actual structure of possible relationships, which we find by seeing through the specific manifestations themselves and into the underlying patterns which condition such manifestations. We needn't attempt to suggest the existence of unobservable entities. We can actually experience the underlying principles themselves through the very same pattern recognition through which our minds are able to recognize musical forms. Through careful attention to the phenomena seen within our physical experiences, the underlying orphenomen comes to light before the eye of the mind. The dynamic interplay of light and darkness is the universal principle which we come to see was always within the color phenomena already. We thus see the color yellow as the experience of light which is being mediated by darkness, in such a manner that the light and darkness remain in balance. We can come to see red as the same experience, but within which the mediating darkness comes to assert dominance over the mediating light. Blue is revealed to be the experience of darkness, which is transmuted by light within an illuminated medium, and that violet emerges when darkness prevails over the mediating illumination. To suggest that there is no purely objective physicality beneath the phenomenological might appear to be a recession into the most ultimate relativism, or even solipsism. But here we can instead begin to see that the more universal reality within the phenomenal in fact consists in organizational elements of possible experience. The objectivity which has been sought by science is in fact the formative reality which lies within the manifest, rather than a substrate of ever more minuscule physical corpuscles or particles. Modern science, so deeply influenced by the British empiricist tradition, has operated under the presumption that fundamental reality consists of quantifiable, physical properties which are entirely objective, physical, and quantifiable, while subjectivity is taken to represent a secondary world, which is presumed to somehow emerge from such a purely objective substrate. Yet if we adhere more rigorously to the principle of empiricism itself, and insist, as did Goethe, that we remain grounded in that which is actually experienced by human awareness, then we come to find that the division between the purely objective and purely subjective is itself an abstraction. We never empirically encounter anything that is purely objective by definition, as anything which we encounter empirically is necessarily phenomenological, and therefore necessarily implicating consciousness. Perhaps we might presume that the smell of a candle is more secondary, more subjective than the physical weight of the candle. The candle might smell differently to different observers, and therefore we might conclude that the smell is in fact no more than a qualitative stamp which the human mind impresses upon its detections of purely objective chemicals. We would be presuming, therefore, that the property of smell is one which is localized within the human mind rather than being a feature of the world itself. The weight of the candle, however, could be taken as objectively real and thus a property which exists outside of our subjective awareness. But how do we actually encounter this physical property of weight empirically? If I take the candle and hold it in my hand, I will experience its weight as a kind of resistance. But it may very well be the case that another person experiences this resistance more strongly. A child, for example, might experience the weight of the candle as far greater as the child's arms and hands are much smaller. One might then argue that regardless of how we might subjectively experience the property of weight, we can nevertheless use a measuring device to determine the objective weight of the candle as it exists independently of any such relationships. We can place the candle upon such a device and declare that the number produced by the device represents the truly real weight of the candle, as different measuring devices will all produce the same number. But the reality is that these measuring devices are specifically designed to relate to weight in the exact same way. All we have proven through this demonstration is that all of our various measuring devices have been correctly calibrated to produce the same numbers for the same objects. We have taken advantage of the constancy of physical matter in order to artificially remove the empirical experience of weight from our calculations. The empirical reality of weight falls by the wayside, and the epistemological primacy of human eyes and hands comes to be replaced by mechanical devices. To say that the weight of the candle is always measured to be the same by our mechanical instruments is fundamentally no different than saying that the candle always smells the same to me. The mechanical devices artificially create a kind of invariant perspective, which can attempt to circumvent the fundamentally relational nature of empirical reality. We delude ourselves into believing that we have achieved an objective, God's eye perspective upon the phenomenon of weight by stepping outside of our own perspectives, when in reality we have only replaced our own perspectives with those of machines. If we are to hold fast to the epistemological primacy of empirical experience, then we must come to see that nature and human consciousness are not divided by a rigid boundary of objectivity and subjectivity. Rather, the world which we actually encounter empirically is of a fundamentally phenomenological, interrelational, and intersubjective character. Everything that is empirically real is necessarily a participation within consciousness, and such participations are defined in relational terms. To see through such relativistic manifestations and into the universal qualities which underlie them is not to seek for invariant physical properties such as length or weight, which might be thought to exist independently of consciousness. Rather, to find the objective within the phenomenological is to find the formative principles which condition such manifestations, to seek the compositional architectures through which possible phenomena are related to one another. The quest for matter proves itself to have been a quest for the great formless mother that is the abyssal akasha, and the quest for the laws of nature proves itself to have been the quest for the harmonic motifs, through which the world improvisationally composes itself into existence. The universal motif, which is the interplay of light and darkness, which we find within the phenomenology of color, can also be seen within the world of mythical, theological, and astrological archetypes. By carefully observing the organization of these primordial forms, we can thus begin to see the truly cosmic universality of such dynamics and the fundamentally prismatic nature of consciousness. Goethe's phenomenology of color demonstrates the way in which the fundamental polarity of light and darkness gives rise to the polarity of yellow and blue, a polarity which Goethe believed to mirror the polarity of major and minor keys in music. Yellow is seen to be the experience of light as mediated by darkness, while blue is seen to be the experience of darkness as mediated by illumination. If we begin to metaphysically generalize this or phenomenon through applying it to the archetypal realm as a whole, we can begin to see that the sun and moon represent a similar polarity which emerges from the dynamic interplay of form and formlessness, primordial masculinity and femininity. As form is transmuted by the indeterminacy of formlessness, we see the emergence of solar telesis, the principle of will which is drawn towards possibilities which are felt as attractors, ideals of ultimate value which animate living processes through drawing the world unto the actualization of such possibilities. As formlessness comes to be given shape by form, we then see the emergence of lunar memory. As the past is created through the living activities of nature, past actualities come to form a kind of substrate of raw materials which can be incorporated into the subsequent unfoldings of the world through the process of inheritance. The lunar past is that which is actualized through the pursuit of solar values, and as such it is in many ways the ultimate objective of nature, the paintings which are impressed upon the canvas of primordial formlessness. This is an approximately 34,000-year-old bone carving discovered in Dordogne, France, and attributed to the Upper Paleolithic Aurignacian culture. It is perhaps the oldest known example of writing which has ever been uncovered by archaeologists, and what we see here is a highly sophisticated lunar calendar which accurately depicts the precessions of lunar cycles. Some researchers believe that such lunar calendars were used by prehistoric peoples as a means of tracking human menstrual cycles, and therefore would have been used as a means of facilitating fertility or for preventing pregnancy in times of scarcity. As this example illustrates, the moon's archetypal associations with pregnancy, childbirth, parenthood, blood relations, and the mystical, life-generating powers of the feminine are immensely ancient. These associations are far from arbitrary. Human menstrual cycles are approximately the same duration as lunar cycles, and therefore regularities of the former could be correlated with regularities of the latter by ancient peoples. Our modern words moon, month, and menstruation share the same etymological root, and such correlations are found throughout numerous human languages. Within various cultures throughout the world, we see that the moon is consistently associated with fertility, parenthood, kinship, and relations to ancestral spirits. These are relations of inheritance through which the past comes to be resurrected within the present. The moon is often associated with forms of magic, which similarly invoke the spiritual powers of the past. Even in modern language, we often refer to rumination as reflection, though we often overlook the invocation of the lunar archetype within such manners of speaking. The moon reflects the light of the sun into the night, and likewise the lunar archetype allows the nocturnal past to be revealed within the light of presently living consciousness. The moon is associated with the substance silver, which is itself associated with purity. For cultures which emphasize the reliable inheritance of the past and thus the conservation of the inherited social order, the concept of purity is of central significance. The relationship between past and future is regarded as a kind of river, and deviations from social norms tend to be regarded as contaminations, which bring forth disease and death. Such emphasis on inheritance, purity, and social adherence is perhaps exemplified most thoroughly by Chinese civilization. Within Chinese culture, the moon is often more highly regarded than any other celestial body, as the moon is associated with purity and familial bonds. During the Age of Sail, the Chinese Empire would only accept silver as payment for trade goods, as the Chinese regarded silver as of much greater value than gold. This association between silver and lunar purity is also more than merely symbolic, as the substance silver has very real antibiotic properties and an extensive history of medicinal uses. While the moon is correlated with the relations of past and present, the sun conversely can be correlated with relations of present and future, with the aims or attractors which pull the world forward unto the realization of the future. Within various forms of mythology and theology, the sun is taken to represent the will, the agency of an individual which moves us through time towards the realization of ideals. Understood in teleological terms, we can see the will is defined by ideals which serve as the guiding light of consciousness, the highest values which serve as centers of gravity for our personal or collective agencies, and the centers of narrative gravity within our personal and collective myths. The world which we encounter is not one of raw data which we then evaluate after the fact. Rather, our cognition of the world as a world at all is itself necessarily a process of evaluating relevance, and such relevance must be understood in terms of implicit ideals. It is only through such values that the human mind is able to experience a world at all, rather than a mere maelstrom of senseless noise. Without the guiding light of solar valuation, we find ourselves not within an intelligible life world, but rather within an incomprehensible chaos. Within Christianity, the figure of Christ is in many ways a kind of solar deity. We can see Christ's halo as a symbolic corollary of the solar corona. Christ represents the living embodiment of the will of God, the cosmic logos, which animates reality itself. Christ is therefore the enactment within human life of the most ultimate value, the self-sacrificial and world-generative love which constitutes the will unto existence, the will unto numinosity. Although I won't be doing a deep dive into the metaphysical associations of the other 8 planetary signifiers in this video, you can check the links in the description for more thorough evaluations of that topic. For now, however, what is significant is the way in which the other planetary signifiers accord with the same general dynamics which we see within the phenomenology of color. Martian red is more thoroughly conditioned by formlessness, and thus can be understood as a more primal, conflict-oriented and action-oriented permutation of the solar will. Martian will, rather than being oriented towards ideals in themselves, tends instead to be oriented towards the achievement of imminent goals, survival, protection, and the overcoming of immediate obstacles. Within the Plutonic principle, we see the solar will conditioned even more by the primality of formlessness. Pluto is the archetype of separation, the division between self and world, which manifests in a sense of the world as an alien, threatening otherness. Plutonic awareness thus manifests as the primal instincts by which an organism is able to survive against the hostility and savagery of nature. Plutonic consciousness is that of the most unconditioned, animalistic impulses of violence, paranoia, hunger, and libidinality. Venusian green is, much like solar telesis, oriented towards idyllic values, whereas the solar will is most fundamentally defined by the affirmation of existence as such. The Venusian archetype is more thoroughly conditioned by the ideal in contrast to the real. Venus is defined by the values of synthesis, harmony, and beauty, and the creative powers of such ideals, but often tends to neglect the actual in favor of the idyllic. Within the archetype of Uranus, we see the principle of telesis expressed in a manner which is even more conditioned by idyllic form in contrast to corporeal actuality. The Uranian principle is that of combustion, of the resolving of tensions, frictions, or chaotic discordances through the explosive breakdown of edifices, systems, and structures. We see the Uranian principle at work within electrical discharge, as disequilibrium attempts to resolve itself into equilibrium in a manner that cuts through or burns through the world in almost complete disregard for whatever actualities it might disintegrate through its motions. Jovian indigo is an expansive principle which attempts to incorporate the world into itself through processes of growth, conquest, or achievement. This incorporation can thus be understood as the more primal, formless permutation of lunar inheritance, which likewise involves the reincorporation of the past. Saturn then represents the solidification, which is the ultimate consequence of such incorporation. Within the Jovian archetype, we see the principle of gravity, manifest as boundless growth and expansion, while within the Saturnian archetype, we see such gravitation expressed as concretion, pressure, and the ontological inertia of that which has been thereby created. The Saturnian realm is that of the dead, the world of that which has already been decided and determined, in contrast to the living world which resides between the possible and the actual. Within Mercury, we see the reflectiveness and receptivity of the lunar archetype inflected more thoroughly by the formative realm. While the lunar is expressed in the reflection, recreation, and reincorporation of the past, the mercurial principle instead comes to reflect forms in themselves. Mercurial consciousness is thus ideational consciousness, which molds itself into accordance with the forms as such. The mercurial principle of noesis therefore finds expression in the activities of thought, language, writing, and imagination. Finally, Neptune, even more dominated by the formative in contrast to the corporeal, represents the principle of idyllic oneness. Like Mercury, Neptunian consciousness is the experience of the ideational, but the Neptunian principle is specifically drawn towards the ideal of undifferentiated utopian boundlessness, and finds expression within fantasies and spiritual experiences, as well as within delusions, escapism, and substance abuse. Now that we have established a general understanding of the overall archetypal composition of the prismatic archetypes, we can now begin to examine ways in which we are able to experience these archetypal dynamics directly through the perception of music. By imposing the circle of fifths upon the astrochromogram, we can begin to see how our experiences of musical motifs are in fact transformations of our own awareness by archetypal forces. By beginning with the solar F natural and following the circle of fifths from right to left until reaching the lunar B natural, we produce the notes of the Lydian scale. The Lydian scale is understood to be the brightest of the diatonic musical modes, and here we can see that the chromatic makeup of Lydian is characterized by its inclusion of all of the upper, radiant archetypes and none of the lower, abyssal archetypes, which here correlate with the black keys of a keyboard. If we shift our sequence to the left so as to incorporate the Martian B flat and exclude the lunar B natural, we now have the notes of the F Ionian mode, or F major. Whereas Lydian is the brightest scale in terms of flats, it is Ionian which has instead come to form the most central formative element of Western diatonic music. Through substituting the Martian element for the lunar element, the essence of Ionian achieves the greatest privileging of the solar will, while nonetheless maintaining its prioritization of the upper, radiant elements over the lower, abyssal elements. If we continue to shift our note sequence to the left, we will achieve increasingly darker modes. Within Mixolydian, we can experience the manner in which the replacement of the mercurial element by the plutonic element results in a major scale which feels much less cerebral and much more oriented towards the natural, immanent world. We commonly find this mixolydian mode in forms of folk music, such as Celtic music and blues music, which are in general much less academic and cerebral than Western classical music. By subtracting some blue and adding some red, mixolydian produces an aura which is characterized much more by shades of green and orange rather than gold, silver, and blue. We then move through the minor modes of Dorian, Aeolian, and Phrygian until finally we arrive upon Locrian, within which we find the mirror image of the Lydian scale, and the greatest prioritization of the abyssal elements among the diatonic modes. If we subtract the abyssal lunar notes from the Phrygian scale, we are left with a much more stable pentatonic minor scale, as the extreme darkness of Phrygian is mitigated by the removal of the Saturnian and Jovian elements. Within blues music, it is common to incorporate a sixth note into the minor pentatonic scale, the flat 5 or tritone, which is commonly known as the blue note. The lunar B natural, which serves to add melancholic dissonance to the otherwise highly consonant form of pentatonic minor. We can continue to see these dynamics at play as we move further beyond the confines of diatonic harmony. If we combine the tones of the outer planets with those of the luminary sun and moon, we create the F whole tone scale. The mirror image of the F whole tone scale is thus the D whole tone scale, which consists of the inner planet tones in combination with pure light and darkness. Thus far, we have taken F natural to be our default root note in accordance with the Western diatonic tradition, which regards the black keys as deviations from the diatonic white keys. With the development of equal temperament tuning systems, however, Western harmony was able to normalize its interval relationships so as to achieve harmonic equivalence between distinct key signatures. With an equal temperament tuning system, we allow ourselves to rotate our circle of fifths relative to our prismatic wheel, and can thus begin to compose music in which we are able to transition between functionally equivalent key centers. Within the transition from just intonation tuning systems to equal temperament tuning systems, we thus can see the exact same achievement of invariance through relativization that we have seen previously in Galilean and Newtonian physics. These transformations of music and physics are both, in fact, manifestations of the perspectival consciousness structure which began to appear within the Western world in the wake of the Italian Renaissance. Through the realization of relativity and perspectivity, human consciousness has brought itself into contact with the multivalency of nature. Phenomenological manifestations are conditioned by context, and the principle of invariance ensures that no perspectival vantage point can be regarded as more epistemologically primary. We have come to understand that our own subjective viewpoints are in many ways limited and conditioned by the contingencies of our own existence. This development of perspectivity has brought us precariously close to the precipice of an absolute and utterly corrosive nihilism, which now threatens the very fabric of human life in general. It is all too easy for the modern intellect to conclude that we simply have no access to an objectively real world beyond our subjective opinions, that values are no more than the arbitrary constructs of social power structures, or even that one's own subjectivity is exhaustive of reality itself. Anti-realism, solipsism, and nihilism have come to constitute the core spiritual illnesses of the modern age. Nonetheless, the emergence of such perspectival awareness was a necessary precondition for the transformations which are now underway. We are now beginning to see that the relativity of the phenomenological is not a result of a Kantian barrier which ever divides us apart from the natural world and from one another. Our consciousness is not, in fact, a mere user interface or screen, which presents us with the shadows of a world which is forever beyond our grasp. We are beginning to uplift our capacities for noetic insight from out of the depths of our unconscious and into the light of our active, conscious agency. In doing so, we come to see that the phenomenological shadows seen by our physical eyes are in fact the outlines of a noetic realm, which is characterized by both formative principles and formless indeterminacy. Through the recognition of our own capacities to see into the essential and elemental forces which are withheld within the manifest, we bring our own inner worlds into communion with the interiority of the world itself. Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason is a breathtaking exemplification of philosophical rigor. Kant was not the type of thinker to suffer unspoken assumptions or gloss over details, and yet within the pages of the Critique of Pure Reason, we find one understated yet striking outlier. Kant addresses the issue of how the human mind is able to connect concepts to sensory perceptions, and finds himself unable to provide an explanation for how we are actually able to do this. When I look at a clock face, for example, certain conceptual contents emerge within the experience along with the sensory perceptions. I don't simply encounter a flood of raw data, but also concepts such as circle, time, and clock. In attempting to address how the mind is actually able to do this, Kant finds himself at a loss, and ultimately concludes that this faculty may simply be an unknowable mystery of the mind's inner workings. This mystery is in many ways the central paradox of perspectival consciousness, as it shows an awareness of the active role which the human mind performs in actually synthesizing the sensorial and ideational contents of experience. We don't see this problem within Platonic philosophy, for example, because within Platonic thought, an experience of an object in the world is an experience of a participation within a certain constellation of forms. The conceptual contents of the experience are not regarded as being supplied by the human mind at all. The forms are already present, and the role of the human mind is in recognizing which forms are giving shape to the experience. Kant, however, was influenced by the Cartesian tradition in such a manner that he had come to see concepts or ideas as objects which are produced by the human mind rather than by the world. When we look at Kant's struggle with the problem of conceptual application, what we are seeing is the culmination of a gradual process through which human consciousness was beginning to become aware of its own role in disclosing reality. Plato could have never actually questioned whether or not his own conceptual framework was adequate to reality. Plato could simply assume that the Hellenistic form language was essentially identical to the world of forms as such. Plato was not yet able to problematize the contingency of his own perspectival frame of reference. Plato was not able to consider, for example, the possibility that a philosopher from a different culture might look at a clock face and see a completely different complex of forms due to seeing the world in a different manner. There is no room for such relativity within Platonic thought. If two philosophers cannot agree upon what forms are present within the clock face, then that can only imply that one of them is simply mistaken about the clock or about the nature of the forms. Platonic thought did include an awareness that the human mind cast light upon the world, which disclosed the formative contents of the world. But Platonic thought had yet to become aware that this disclosure was conditioned by a form language, which characterized the nature of the human imagination. Plato was thus unable to consider the relativity of his own internal form language in the manner which we see in modern philosophy, as expressed in the confrontation with radical skepticism and radical relativism. Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, however, is a work dedicated specifically to the problematization of such perspectival relativity. Kant came to believe that the only way to save objectivity itself from Hume's radical skepticism was by taking the invariance which was once attributed to nature itself and relocating it within the interior of the human mind in the form of the synthetic a priori categories. Unlike Plato, Kant is able to see the active role of the human intellect in connecting conceptual and sensorial contents, and is thus able to see that the ideational contents of human experience are not simply given to us by the world. Kant was beginning to become aware of his own imaginative faculty, but was not yet able to truly bring this faculty into the light of consciousness, due to the fact that he continued to see conceptual contents as the products of the human mind rather than the contents of the world itself. Kant was thus attempting to walk a tightrope above the abyssal maw of ultimate relativism. If formative ideational contents were sequestered within the human mind, then objective truth would need to become entirely dependent upon the universal aspects of human subjectivity if truth was to survive at all. Kant's synthetic a priori was a last-ditch effort to save philosophy from itself. With Goethe's philosophical naturalism, however, we see the ultimate resolution of this trajectory. In his experimental engagements with nature, Goethe was seeking ideas within the world, and this pursuit can be seen in stark contrast with the Platonic pursuit, which sought the forms within a purely transcendental realm, and with modernist thought, which presumed ideas to exist only within the human mind. Goethe was aware that his own imagination was an active participant in the disclosure of the world, and that the contents of his own imaginal form language conditioned this disclosure. But Goethe was also aware that such formative contents were contents of the world, not simply the human experience of the world. Goethe thus came to see that he could actively incorporate new forms into his own imaginal faculty by participating in the natural world itself and thus prompting nature to reveal its own compositional elements. Goethe's naturalism thus represents a radical mutation of human consciousness, in the exact same manner as Platonic philosophy. As with many other spiritual developments of the axial age, Platonism represented the incorporation of the dialogical faculty, or intellect, into the human ego, thus incorporating our own inner voices in such a manner that we came to experience the inner dialogue as something which we do rather than something which happens to us. Likewise, Goethe's naturalism indicates the beginnings of the incorporation of the human imaginal faculty into the human ego. Our imaginative capabilities thus become something which we enact, rather than something which occurs in a purely unconscious, bodily manner. An unconscious state which we see exemplified in Kant's inability to understand how his own mind was able to bring concepts and sensations into accordance with one another. By continuing along the path laid out by Goethe, we can come to see that the world of forms is not limited to the contents of the human mind, nor is the world of forms a purely transcendental realm consisting of static, eternal objects, but rather the forms are found to be contained within the interiority of the beings which comprise nature. Moreover, we come to see that these inner worlds are not rigid structures. They are, just like musical objects, hyperdimensional objects, which can never be fully exhausted by any given act of disclosure. There is always more to see, in other words, and what we see is conditioned by the degree to which we are able to become active participants in the inner workings of our own imaginal capabilities. Thanks for watching. Alright everybody, so I decided I wanted to wrap this one up by turning on the camera and illustrating things with more like hand gestures and whatnot, rather than trying to attempt to use images and things like that, because I want to bring in a kind of allegory here for maybe helping to illustrate some of the ideas that I've been talking about in this video and some of the distinctions I'm trying to make. So we're all probably familiar with the allegory of Plato's cave, right? So you are chained up in the cave, and the cave represents the somatic, physical, immanent world, and you're only able to see shadows which are being projected on the cave wall, and then the idea is to get outside of the cave so you can actually experience the transcendental realm. And of course, this is Plato's allegory for achieving gnosis effectively. But it's a kind of gnosis that really involves kind of getting away from the world, getting away from nature. So what I want to introduce here is another kind of allegory that I've cooked up, and I'm calling it Goethe's cave. And the initial premise is essentially the same, right? You're in a cave, and the cave is nature, and you've got these shadows on the cave wall, and you can't quite figure out what the shadows are of. You can't figure out what objects or entities are projecting the shadow, because the shadow just kind of looks like a blob to you. And so you're sitting there and you're looking at the shadow and you're trying to figure it out, and then you look around and you notice that you've got some like little buttons and levers and stuff that you can play around with. And so you start fiddling with that, and you notice that the shadow starts changing. And so you play around with this for a moment, and eventually you start to realize what's happening. The object behind you, which is casting the shadow on the wall, is on some kind of pedestal or something, and your little buttons and levers are actually rotating or tilting the object behind you so as to change the shadow that it is casting. And so by doing this, you're then able to kind of fiddle around with it, and you're able to actually perceive what the object is, even though you can't actually turn around and look at it, because you can perceive all the different shadows that it can cast. And that then allows you to see with your mind the object which is behind you, even though you can't see it with your eyes. So the allegory here then is that those buttons and levers and whatnot that you have in front of you represent what we could call integral or imaginal consciousness, the capacity for the human ego to actually be directly involved in a conscious way and agential way in the functioning of our own imaginal faculties. And what I've been arguing here is that this is a relatively new capability. This is not some kind of ancient wisdom that we are digging up from, the Hermetic tradition or Plato or ancient Egypt or whatever. This is actually a radically new thing that has only really existed since like the late 18th century-ish, if that. There are probably some forerunners, precursors we could talk about, but by and large, this is something that we can do that Plato could not do. And the bigger picture here is that by going through what Jean Gebser would call the perspectival structure of consciousness, we've gotten to a point where we're able to start to see that the inner workings of the world, the noumenon, as it were, consists of these hyperdimensional objects which contain within them all of the possible manifestations, all of the possible disclosures which our consciousness could bring to light. So, of course, in this video, I focused primarily on Goethe as a prime example of this capability, partially because Goethe was one of the first, if not the first, to really be able to do this in a kind of systematic way. Now, there are other examples, many figures actually, who could also be taken as exemplifying this. Jean Gebser, I think, is probably one of the most important figures. My channel started off talking about Jean Gebser, and I'm definitely going to be talking about him further in future videos. But another prime example of this would be Rudolf Steiner. And Rudolf Steiner is particularly important here because Steiner really adds something to what Goethe puts on the table. And it's that Steiner takes Goethe's methodology, his phenomenological naturalism, and instead of necessarily applying it to things like plants and colors and minerals and whatnot, Steiner also turns the telescope around, as it were, and begins using that methodology to examine the contents of human consciousness as such. And this is where we're going to be trying to go with the channel moving forward into subsequent videos, because that's what I'm interested in right now. Steiner believed that by turning the telescope around in that way, that he was able to do cosmology. He referred to his philosophy, his system, his school as anthroposophy. So that anthro, of course, indicates that he is interested in human beings and human consciousness. But Steiner also believed that by studying human consciousness in this way, he was also doing cosmology. And the reason why is because he believed that the human being was really the ultimate culmination of cosmic evolution, and therefore the human being, the human body, the human mind contain within them the whole of the universe and the whole of cosmic history leading up to our present situation. So that's where we will be going next, and I'm happy to have you guys on board with me. I hope to see some of you new people in future videos. Like and subscribe and all that nonsense. So yeah, that's all I got to say. Take it easy. Thanks for watching. Blah blah blah. Later.